Good afternoon, chairs and ranking members. I'm here to testify in support of Senate Bill 103, but I sort of wanted to bring up an issue and expand upon. I think that this bill is sort of trying to get to, and that is, we talked about the data privacy bill that was done last year. It doesn't extend to government agencies. And so what's going on right now in the state of Connecticut through our budget is we are consolidating all of the IT through the Department of Administrative Services. And I think a lot of that right now is being done through MOUs, through memorandums of understanding. And I think we need to look at making sure that certain data privacy rules are applying to government agencies as well. Right now, there's significant data that does get collected through our agencies, whether it's DRS or DOL certainly have heightened sensitive information. And there's no protections of portal logins, making sure that, the interfaces are preventing sort of, robots from coming in. But also more importantly, in my testimony, back when we were going through COVID and the state had contracted with a company to provide for the COVID testing, that company was collecting all of our genetic information and aggregated it, took that information, made millions off of it, and it was used for a proprietary purpose. I think in the situation where government is engaging in third-party contracts, especially where our residents are required to use those services, that our information should be protected at some level. And there aren't conversations about this at all. And so on the one hand, we do have protections at the federal level for our healthcare information, but it doesn't necessarily apply, across the board with some of the information that the government is actually acquiring. Especially we're getting into arenas with paid family medical leave, with the retirement program that's being rolled out, and there's more and more data that private individuals are sort of handing over to government that we never envisioned before. DRS collects customer information for oil companies right now as they move to an online platform. When they pay their excise taxes, that information was never collected in a paper form, but because we now have these interfaces, it's giving our agencies the opportunity to sort of grab information that regulation or statute doesn't necessarily require, and we need to make sure that data is protected. So I thought that this was a piece of legislation that might be able to expand on that. And with that, I'm happy to answer any questions.
Okay. Representative Tigliano, then Representative Pizzuto.
Good afternoon, Representative. So I wasn't aware that they were collecting the genetic information for COVID tests, because I remember taking COVID tests. I didn't really sign anything. I didn't authorize anything. Did they share and make money off of that anonymously, or was our names or whatever associated with the information?
So when you signed up to get the test, and when you got the email results, and I think it might have even been prior to the test, that information was given to you. I do have a copy of it. It was 6 pages in fine print that you read through, and in it very clearly said that they were collecting that information. I don't think it was a secret on the company's end. It was a bio medical company that had gotten involved in the testing, so their line of business really was genetic studies, and that was the purpose for them getting into it, so they could collect that data. So they weren't necessarily quiet about it, but you had to really read through the document to realize what you were giving up.
They were pretty quiet about it to me. I didn't have I didn't realize. But was it so my name is associated with my genetic information in some weird company's database?
Well, so they claim they aggregate it. So but who, I think they also do, they keep your medical information. So I think you're protected under federal law for the individualized information, but it was then aggregated and it's used for studies now. And my point being, it was the government that contracted with them, not us. And so many of us were forced to use that service. Similarly, when you pay taxes, when you register your business, we're required to interface with government. And I just think if they're going to be collecting our data, we need to hold them to the same standards that we're holding private business to, because they're getting into proprietary areas.
So to speak more back on the data privacy thing, I know the controller was rolling out the retirement security bill. The program has proposed a bill that allows that the intergovernmental agencies enter into agreements where they share data. They're basically sort of acting like a marketing company or like a private company, because I guess they want to market to you for the retirement security program and other programs the government is coming up with. Are they exempt from the state's data privacy standards? Would
they are? They are under the current laws, I think, that we have. They are all exempt from it. And I think in particular with that plan, it could be a marketing piece, but they're also getting our information. So Department of Labor, when they interface, I think it's much of their money comes from the federal government. So our Department of Labor has to comply with the federal laws, which have protections in place that the commissioner has to comply with, but that's not the same for other state agencies. So we might be getting lucky with Department of Labor. Well, not lucky, but the construct of the Department of Labor is such that that information and data is required to be protected, but it's not the same for other agencies.
So you're saying that that same protection wouldn't be there for the controller's office, who is tasked with running the retirement security program?
That's right. And the bigger concern I have right now is if you look in the budget, we are combining all of our IT with Department of Administrative Services with one agency. If DOL or DRS is now forced to interface and use that agency to create a platform that people are going to interact with, because I think we want to be more user friendly. So we want to be able to go to one portal, have one login, and get your information. All these agencies don't have any standards that they have to abide by. And so I think, given the fact that this is now happening today, I think the legislature needs to take a look at this. And like I said, I think there's memorandums of understanding that are already being put out and executed between agencies that I'm not sure they're covering any of these protections.
Are you aware of any recent data privacy breaches of state agencies?
Well, when I first got elected in 2006, I was part of that lost laptop that caused my information to be to end up all over the place. But we constantly are fighting it. When the Department of Labor switched over to their new software system, I think they knew that the dark web was going to hit them, and they put fraud protections in place. Now, me as an employer, and I think the commissioner actually, I think she's required to by federal law, not positive, but she disclosed what those data breaches were, and I referenced it in my testimony. Not every agency needs to disclose it. So in the situation in 2007, I think it was, when my information was breached, that wasn't immediately disclosed. It had to be leaked and found out. And I think that's another flaw at the system. But when the commissioner released that information, and in speaking with the Department of Labor, they have guardrails in place and hoops to jump through for fraud protection in their application process. And I think we're still struggling with it. But again, those are procedures that they've put in place that should be a model for the rest of the agencies. And I'm not sure they have it. All the other agencies have it.
Well, what prompted that question is because I don't know about you, but I applied for unemployment in October, unbeknownst to me. And then I might have got it I don't know. I have actually no idea if I got it or not. I just know that I applied. If I'm not mistaken, that actually happened to you too.
Yeah, it did. I mean, it's real. It's out there. It's happening. And, for the most part, I think the department dealt with it. Now, we've had some that the department, stops before the application goes through. I did have a situation just last week where some of the money got out the door before we could catch the fraud. So it's a real struggle. I mean, I think the commissioner of labor is probably the best one to speak to on this issue because she's constantly dealing with it regularly. I'm not so sure other agencies, when you interface, just to pick on the Secretary of the State, when you register and interface with the Secretary of State's website, it's a little bit looser and easier to get in and file information for a lot of obvious reasons. And I wouldn't take issue with it, the way that interface works, and it's convenient for people. But again, if we're consolidating all of these activities into one agency, I think we've got to start this broader conversation.
So would you imagine this applying to state contracts, as they often include the collection of data along with sensitive information and health records?
Yeah, I mean, I think it needs to include, I mean, as I alluded before with COVID, there are times that government is performing a service that we never envisioned. And in particular, collecting data. We've dealt with this issue with students, the student data privacy, those protections are in place, but again, it's federal law, it's not state law. So when we were looking at passing different pieces of education over the years, that was always part of our conversation. I remember the debates on the House floor of what information was going to be aggregated by the State Department and what protections are in place for the individual students. And we always were comforted that we fell back on the fact that federal law is protecting us. We are starting to see such an expansive use of data and even of algorithms, which, there's been some stories out there with the agencies are actually actively using algorithms in their line of work, DCF in particular, that I think we need to get our arms around it.
I'm going to open up to other people because I have a couple of more questions, only because it's almost like I want to understand it a little better. So if the government, one of the agencies is rolling out the retirement security program, right? They're rolling this out. So they're essentially acting like a business. They can go to other government agencies currently and get whatever data they all could share. That could, who has a job, who has a business, whatever. If you interacted with the Secretary of State or a voter or whatever.
So it's a great point, and that's one of my concerns. So, the Department of Revenue Services, when they changed their platform to an online platform for our oil companies, currently under law, there's a paper filing, and you like your sales tax, you file your excise tax, submit that paperwork to the state. The online platform now requires the oil vendors to submit every single customer and how much oil was delivered to each customer. Now, it doesn't take a lot to think that if that information is shared with the Commissioner of Environmental Protection, does that start the conversation of, carbon footprint? And let's take a look at, should we do a carbon footprint tax? And that policy might have merit, it may not. Obviously, I don't think it does, but the reality is that is data that DRS is collecting, that I'm not sure any reg or any statute allows them to collect that specific information. And there's nothing then preventing them from sharing that with other agencies. And I just don't think that's the role of government. I think we need to be more open and transparent in the way that we act.
Thank you. Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I'll turn it over to others.
Thank you. Representative Pizzuto.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Welcome, Representative. I see these genealogy companies out there. Let's study your family history and so forth. And when they do that, they actually say in there, they obtain DNA that they can sell. So they can get that to an insurance company. And they may say the Pizzuto family may be predisposed to cancer, so they're not a good risk to sell them policies. And you fast forward that and you apply that to other things throughout the state. If the bad people get a hold of medical records or personnel records, payroll records, whatever, there's a need probably for ransomware. And my question to you then is, do we have a cybersecurity team, if we do put this under one umbrella, that can handle something like that?
And that's a great question. I think it depends on the agencies. We don't know what kind of IT department they've had and what protections are in place. And so what I get concerned about, I'm not thrilled with the MOU process in state government. So we've seen this, we saw it with school construction, which that didn't work out so well for us, where there are MOUs created that delegate agency authority from one agency to another without any transparency. You can't get that information unless you FOI it and see what they're doing. And I think that process has already started when it comes to IT.
And one last thing, I've seen in past administrations, they tried to consolidate, it might have been under DAS. Everybody in the state would use one IT system. And you go, you know what it's like with Apple and Android and computers, Dell computers and so forth. When they do that, quite often, there are hundreds of fixes to make that data work. And they then download that onto a storage device and they start sharing that. And so even now within agencies, just when you upgrade your software, it never usually works right away because you need these fixes and someone has to have the data to analyze that. And so I guess my question again to you is what currently is in place when we do upgrades to our IT departments in every agency? What do they do with the old data when it gets converted?
So a lot of it, I think they contract with third parties. But also, I mean, part of the conversation I think needs to happen is when you contract with those third parties to do the upgrades, you know, what minimum criteria should be put in place? You know, what level of data protection should those contracts contain? You know, looking at when they were doing the obviously this started for me a little bit under COVID when we were contracting with so many different agencies. And when we were starting the passport system, which didn't really go very far, that had piqued my interest because we had a third-party vendor that's collecting information on what stores you're going to and tracking that all, and that's valuable data. And I don't think we ever got a hold of their contract, but the Envision, the company they worked with, the New York contract was put right up online so you could see it. And they talked about what level of protection you had as a user of those services. And it was very clearly that this information was shared to third parties and it was sold. It's proprietary. And of course, I don't begrudge the companies from doing this. I mean, they're making money off of it. But if the government is contracting with these agencies, I mean, they're in the proprietary market. They should be subject to the same restrictions that we're placing on businesses right now.
Thank you. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you. Are there questions? Representative D'Agostino.
Just on the last point, I mean, this is more for OLR and just a breakdown of our privacy law, but my understanding was that the privacy law did cover those third-party vendors, the various requirements we put in place last year, and anything we put in place this year would as well. But we should look at the draft bill just to make sure that that's the case, because obviously it's a valid point and an easy one to fix, which is you don't get a governmental shield simply by contracting with the government.
And so, correct. If certain private companies would be subject to our privacy laws, but when you discuss the retirement board, if you're, we did the GLBA entity level exemption. So, and then also a HIPAA entity level exemption. So if we were partnering with any entities that were covered by that, they have an exemption, but it is a good point. We don't want to just spread that shield. Yeah. Are there any questions online? Okay, I actually, no. I do have a few questions for you. One, I want to thank you for coming forward to testify, to say that I think that, you know, a lot of the things we need to work through will probably take more time than we can do here. So I hope that you would be willing to work with us as we move forward in this. So one of the things it just sounds like you're saying is rather than creating an Office of Artificial Intelligence, it would be more like creating a chief data officer, right? We already have a chief information officer, but I think a chief data officer could apply to both what we're looking at, the artificial intelligence, algorithmic decision-making, as well as data privacy. Is that, I mean, I don't want to put words in your mouth, but is that?
I think it needs, in my opinion, it needs to be a little bit broader. I think the algorithm piece is critical as well, but I do think we also need to look at the data. So yes, I would agree.
Sure. And agreed on the transparency piece that you mentioned, that we should be modeling behaviors we expect out of the companies. So I think that the transparency applying to what we're doing. Also, when you mention the algorithms, I do think that is critical, that we're testing them ahead of time. I think the DCF you've seen in other parts of the country, in Allegheny County, it's not DCF there, it's like Youth and Family Service, YCFS or something, but they had an algorithm for when they were going to do investigations, and we've seen it. One of the things I do worry about, and that I think we need to, flesh out, and that's what the public hearing process is for, is that if we are putting too many requirements on, are we going to have vendors not apply, right? Are we going to miss out on some vendors who will say, you know what, I'm worried if I have, if we're subject to all of these impact assessments ahead of time and they're subject to FOI, I don't want to have to reveal source code or, whatever it is. So I'm wondering if there's a way, trade secret exemptions or other things that we could put in that would, again, we want that transparency, as you said, but we also don't want to disadvantage companies, right? And have them reveal their secret sauce, so to speak.
Yeah, and I think we're more apt to have that happen in the world of algorithms. I think it's a little bit easier with data, and looking at, we already have with, like, I'll pick on the Department of Labor. We already they're already subject to certain levels of scrutiny because of the federal money that comes in, and that might be a starting point to take a look.
And that brings up a good question. So if we're not able to start as expansively as we would like, so Department of Labor, are there other areas where you would say would be a good starting point?
Yeah, I mean, I think that looking at the agencies that are collecting, that proprietary information, I think the examples that were given, certainly DRS, DOL is really almost a federal animal, and even looking at DCP.
Great. Thank you very much.
Thank you.